This is the Blueprint Podcast, bringing you the latest in cyber defense and security operations from top blue team leaders. Blueprint is brought to you by the SANS Institute and is hosted by SANS Senior Instructor John Hubbard. And now here's your host, John Hubbard.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blueprint. Today, back again, we have our guest from the very, very first episode of Blueprint, and now my official co-author on Management 551, which is our security operations leadership course, Mark Orlando. Welcome back to the podcast, Mark.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me.
So, similar in somewhat of a nature to our first conversation, we're here to talk about security operations again, but we're going to take a different angle on it today. This is obviously something we're both passionate about, teach and do all that kind of stuff. But this is a conversation I wanted to have based on a talk that you recently did at BlackHat, and it covers a lot of stuff that we might not touch on in a lot of typical SOC training classes. The kind of teamwork aspects of how do we make sure a SOC is doing the best that it can without looking at like, oh, can we use Wireshark and can we, get our PCAPs and all that kind of technical stuff, more interaction in between the members. Let's start off giving the listeners a quick refresher on your background. And then if you could kind of give us the story of what led up to that talk and this research and your interest in it.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. So, pretty much my entire background in cybersecurity is in cyber defense and security operations. So I started out myself as a SOC analyst back in 2001 and worked my way up from there. And I've built and led and worked in security operations teams of all shapes, sizes, and sectors. Built many 24/7 security operations teams here in the U.S. in the public sector at the White House, the Department of Energy, healthcare.gov, a lot of other government agencies, and I've done a lot of work in managed security services as well. Built out one of the early threat hunting as a service kind of offerings, what you might call an MDR now, which was acquired by Raytheon. And then I was the chief technology officer for Raytheon's cybersecurity business for a few years before leaving to start my own company, which I co-founded. It's called Bionic. And as you might guess, we are focused also on cyber defense. So kind of been in this realm for a very long time now. And of course, as you mentioned, I'm also working with SANS as an instructor and your co-author for Management 551, as well as your other class on security operations, Sec 450. So spent a lot of time thinking about these problems, seen a lot of evolution in that space over the last several years. And one of the things that I've noticed is that there are a lot of teams out there that, especially these days, do not want for resources. I think we've done a really good job kind of educating, and certainly we've seen the impacts of many of these high-profile breaches and some of the vulnerabilities that have come to light. And so, what I've noticed is that there are teams that have a lot of great technology, and they have really, really skilled people, and they have a lot of support and organizational buy-in. But as we continue to work with these security teams, we notice that you can have all of the tools, you can know all of the right things, you can have a lot of really capable people doing great work, but teams are still struggling. They're still struggling to do the right things proactively. They're still very much in a reactive kind of mode. And one of the things that I came across as trying to come up with better solutions to help these teams get more proactive, to work together more effectively, I came across this really, really interesting research that was done a few years ago by some behavioral scientists at George Mason University in cooperation with Department of Homeland Security and several other groups. And this research was all around social maturity in incident response teams. And it was a really unique kind of way of approaching this challenge of helping teams work together more effectively and spreading some of the knowledge and the skills more evenly across the team. And it was one of those things where when I read the research, a light bulb kind of went off, and I said, hey, I don't really think many teams are looking at this. We're very, very focused on, better alerts, faster response, a lot of the technical aspects, which are also important. But I just felt like it was a space that not many people were looking at. So that's how I came to meet one of those researchers, Dr. Daniel Shore, and give a presentation last fall at BlackHat Europe on the topic. So that's kind of my background. I think, that's one of the things that I'm looking at today, one of the challenges that I'm trying to solve.
Yeah, and that's an important one too, especially these kind of unturned over rocks where there's stuff that might make a significant difference. And according to the research, right, it does, right? And we're going to get into that. The stuff that maybe teams are completely blind to and don't even think about is maybe something that's affecting them. So to start high level here, this research, could you explain a little bit about like what was done and what they were looking for and maybe some of just the base findings, and then we can dig into them in more detail?
Absolutely. So Dr. Shore and his team, this is a rather large team of researchers, as I said, kind of cross-functional, group of individuals from a few different organizations. They did a very in-depth study. In fact, it was perhaps the largest social behavioral study of information security teams that's ever been done. It was done over the span of 5 years. They spent over 50,000 hours doing this research, working with 17 different organizations across the United States and Europe. They did surveys. They embedded with incident response teams. They kind of hit this research from a lot of different angles. And they found, as you kind of said, they found that incident response is, in fact, a very social activity, which I think we could have guessed. We knew that. But I think they were able to isolate kind of a few challenges in building up those social connections and helping those teams work more effectively together. One of the aspects that I thought was very interesting that I hadn't heard of before was this concept of multi-team systems. So a lot of their research describes these multi-team systems and how they work or can work more effectively together. And that's something that I know I hadn't really thought of before, which is we often think of the incident response team, it's the security team, and they're doing everything from identification, containment, eradication, recovery. But of course, those things don't just happen in a vacuum. Right? It's a security team working with a lot of other teams, infrastructure, networking team, service desk, users. And so a major focus of this study and a lot of their findings was this concept of a multi-team system, which is really the apparatus that supports incident response and how to make that multi-team system work together more effectively. It's not just about the security team working better together, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah. And so, given your background on working in a bunch of different teams and a whole bunch of different kind of sectors and sizes and kind of different styles of organizations, thinking about multi-team systems and the problems that often arise, what are some of the things that maybe the research found that you've also kind of seen play out? And I don't know if you have any maybe representative, examples or anything like that. Anything come to mind there that you think is one of the big hitters?
Sure. I think there were a lot of things that I took away from that. On the social side of things, I think the research bore out that relationships don't often form in a way that maximizes what's possible from an operational perspective. So you might work with somebody on another team and you build up a relationship through that ongoing interaction. But does that necessarily mean that you and this other individual or your team and this other team are going to be able to bring your technical and analytics skills to bear most effectively in a crisis situation? Those are two kind of very different things. So just because you interact on a regular basis, there has to be some intentionality in how those relationships are built and how they're cultivated. And I certainly have seen this in many different circumstances. I think, one kind of anecdotal thing I'll talk about here that I kind of thought back to very often when I was going through this research and we were putting together our presentation is that I thought back to my time at healthcare.gov. This was a very unique environment. It was 100% servers, applications, cloud infrastructure, no users. So it's not a traditional corporate environment where you've got users that are emailing and web browsing, and it's all on the application side. And of course, in this scenario, your users, your constituency, would be kind of everyone, right? Everyone in the US who might need to access this healthcare marketplace. And in this environment, having the SOC, we weren't just going out and saying, hey, this user got compromised, they got phished and their workstation got infected, so we had to respond to that. No, this was a highly collaborative environment where if we had an issue with an application or some public-facing service, there was very little that the security team was going to go out and just do in terms of containment and eradication. So, working in a way that was highly reliant on engineering teams, site reliability engineers, teams like that. And, I just from that perspective, I think this really resonated. And there were a few different problems that were described in particular here. And I think this kind of gets into the talk that we gave, which was the superhero problem. This is where no matter what your team looks like, I think it's sort of a natural thing in security operations that you start to become very reliant on a few key individuals, maybe the more senior individuals or the strongest personalities. And over time, you sort of develop a habit where you just rely on those key individuals to come in and save the day and run things in a crisis. And we also talked about this concept of a teamwork problem, where we're really heavily focused on technical capabilities, not so much on how you affect a good collaborative response to issues. There's this concept of the firefighter problem or the firefighting problem, which is we're constantly in these reactive sort of crisis mode. So we need to adapt. We need to work together effectively. We need to build good relationships. That doesn't really happen very well when you're in the middle of a crisis. And then finally, there's this what we call the lone wolf problem, which is we have really talented people in our field, very highly technically skilled. There aren't a lot of incentives or motivation for those people to work effectively as part of a team. That might be something that is kind of a nice to have, but we don't often have that intentionality there. And we say, it's really great that you're a skilled analyst. It's great that every time there's an incident, you're kind of the one that drives things because the systems really well, the environment really well, but there's not a lot of incentive there for those lone wolves, right? Those rock stars to kind of take a step back, say, let me make sure that my team can step in here and do those things. So anyway, those are some of the things that kind of resonated with me based on my experience.
Yeah. So the way you phrased it, maximizing potential for relationships, right? And or something of that very close nature. I think I'm stating the obvious here, saying those four things you just mentioned, right? If we didn't have those kind of effects showing up, is that something that leads to a much more efficient and maximized potential in terms of like people working together? Like those are the specific problems that were called out?
We'll be back after a quick break.
If you're enjoying this episode, then you're undoubtedly interested in building the strongest security operations team that you can. For those who want to go even deeper, did you know that SANS has not one, but 2 courses that cover security operations centers as well? For the leaders, managers, and directors out there, my co-author Mark Orlando and I offer 551, Building and Leading Security Operations Centers. This course covers building your team, your physical and virtual workspace, getting the right data into your tools, and then focusing on security priorities through everyday execution of important security tasks and building the best SOC team possible. For the technical practitioners out there, my course Sec 450, Blue Team Fundamentals, Security Operations and Analysis is designed to cover everything you need to jump in being the best SOC analyst that you can be. We cover important data types, SOC tools, security logs, malware, analysis technique, automation, and much, much more. In addition, if you want to prove you can deliver the best on any security team, both courses have an accompanying certification available from GIAC. That's the GSOM for 551 and the GSOC for 450. Check out both courses and free demos available on the SANS website. You can get registered today for an in-person course at one of our many events, or go to On Demand and take either class anywhere at your own pace. Thanks for listening.
Yes, those were some of the specific problems that were called out. There were some other things, I think, getting a little bit further into the science behind it and some of the research. There are a lot of factors that contribute to those problems that I just described. And I think those are kind of things that I've seen operationally. I'm sure you've experienced some or maybe all of those as well.
Yep.
I think on the behavioral science end of things, Dr. Shore talked a lot about this concept of egocentrism, which is different than ego being kind of a negative. In this case, we're talking about InfoSec workers just feeling like they can and should do things just on their own. And I think that there's some kind of underlying pervasive messaging there, whether it's intentional or not, that says everybody is an island. As an InfoSec person, as a responder or an analyst, you yourself have to be really capable. You have to be able to do everything. You have to know everything. So I think egocentrism, which is different than being egotistical, is a big part of that. I think one of the things that the researchers, many of whom did not have an InfoSec background, these are behavioral scientists. One of the things that they noticed was cybersecurity is, this really complex ecosystem, complex problems. A lot of it comes down to skill sets and knowledge that no one team is going to have, no one person is going to have. And, so I think this gets back to that concept of multi-team systems, and you have to work together more effectively at a social level before you can effectively bring your skills to bear. So those are some of the factors I know that Dr. Shore described, some of the things that he talked about in our presentation. I found the egocentrism part to be very, I don't know, that also resonated with me because I think we see that a lot, right? I have to do everything on my own. I'm going to bring people in only when I absolutely have to, but otherwise it's all on me. And, really that's not the way. That's not how we're going to scale. It's not how we're going to be effective.
Sure. So let's go look at the superhero problem as we termed it for 1 minute. That problem being we have one person that might be really, really talented, right? And then we have another, most people are going to be average, right? By definition, right? As it goes. What we're aiming for, I'm assuming, is bringing everyone up as high as we possibly can in terms of talent and abilities and knowledge. What are some of the things, if you think you have a team that's like overly reliant on one person that's just really taking on probably too much work and might, end up burning themselves out, right? If they keep doing that, what are the tactics and what are the team, like how do teams start to move towards a more kind of even distribution of helping or kind of spreading that knowledge around the team?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do. I think probably some of the more obvious things would be job rotation, right? And I talked a little bit about having to have some intentionality in how you kind of force the team to work more effectively together. And I think a very practical way of doing that is in that next crisis situation, you take that kind of rock star and you say, guess what? You're in the back seat. You're still a key member of the team, but for this one, this other individual needs to step up and kind of run that. And I think there are a lot of parallels to that in many other disciplines, right? I know before I was in cybersecurity, I was in the military, and that was a big part of it, right? Which is, okay, well, in this exercise, what happens if this person is suddenly unavailable? That person that everybody's relying on, that leader. So you have to kind of, train for the position above you. You have to really understand all the positions kind of, junior to you as well. And I think, that's one thing that we can carry over into InfoSec, which is what if that key person is not around? Then what do you do? And we have to sometimes force those scenarios to play out and give those other individuals an opportunity to step in. So I think that's one thing. I think paying attention to how your team interacts and who's doing what is also, a big part of this. So, one of the things in teaching and in consulting that I spend a lot of time on is metrics, right? What data are you collecting that tells you whether things are status quo, if those daily operations are working as they should? And we're sometimes very, very focused on technical aspects, collection, detection, response, all those things, which are, of course, very important. Less so on, who is making updates in all of your tickets? What's the distribution of case notes, right? At various stages of the investigation, how many different names are in there in your incident management system? Who served as incident lead, for the past dozen or so incidents that you worked? At what point are your team members engaging each other or engaging other groups in this multi-team system? And I think, there are a few different sort of data points that we can collect on that front. So I think, one of the things is sort of forcing that job rotation or that role rotation a little bit. I think another thing would be collecting those key data points and making that part of your metrics in terms of, what does that team participation look like? What does collaboration look like? Who's most active? Who's driving a lot of these discussions? I think those data points are almost just as key as the technical data points of how fast did we respond? How effectively did we respond? Because if you're only gathering those latter data points, things might look great, right? And you might say, well, why do I have to pay attention if the work is happening the way it should? But it can give you a false sense of confidence, because if all of those things are so reliant on those rock stars, those superheroes, you could be one sick leave or vacation or one crisis away from having those metrics look very, very different if that person suddenly becomes unavailable.
Yeah, it's kind of like you're making a very fragile team. It's not very resilient to any, it works great when it's working, and then if it doesn't work, it goes downhill real fast. Right. I love that you brought up the metrics thing. One of the things I always ask guests, and I'm sure it's because of our mind meld teaching the same kind of stuff, I'm always asking and always thinking, like, how do I know if this is a problem? So calling out, like, how do I measure if one person's doing too much? I love that kind of thing, and to anyone that's listening out there, that's the kind of actionability, I'm always trying to strive for in this podcast is like, yeah, we can say this might be a problem, but like, how do we measure if we, So that's all kind of great stuff. And I'd love to hear anything kind of on that as well as we keep talking here. The firefighting problem, same kind of thing, right? We're maybe always in reaction mode and not enough in proactive. Let's try to, make things better longer term and all that kind of stuff. What can we do about that? Because some teams are there and it's really hard to pull yourself out when you have so much work. You don't really get the feeling like, oh, I'm going to do all this other kind of stuff that doesn't really feel urgent right now. What did the research say? And in your experience, what are the solutions to teams that are constantly just buried in firefighting?
Yeah, so I think, both in terms of the research, the study that we're talking about, and just kind of real world lessons, I think you have to build in that time for team building. You have to build in time for making those social connections and building trust between team members, which means that social aspect is very important. Does it mean we all need to be best friends and hanging out on the weekends? No, of course not. But it does mean that we have to have, that social connection so that I trust you and I'm okay stepping back. If I'm the rock star or you're the rock star, I know that, if that key person isn't around, I still kind of trust that, not only the work is going to get done, but I have an awareness of what your skills are and what you're capable of, and you have the same. So I think making time to build those social connections is really important. Certainly, I think that was borne out in the research, but also, there are specific things that leaders and managers can do to help improve that awareness and improve that social maturity. So, taking time once a week to sit the team down during that team meeting and say, all right, everybody, let's walk through that last investigation. Let's talk about it. And I know, for example, in class, we talk about a few different methods of doing that, right? That sort of post-incident analysis, or doing like a pre-mortem where you think, here's the worst case scenario. Like, let's imagine that. And then let's talk about all the things, maybe the mistakes or all the things that could lead to that worst case scenario, and sort of talk through those. A lot of these things, they don't have to be really time consuming. We might be talking about a 15-minute exercise, over the course of an entire week, but it does make a difference. And I think you have to find the time to block out to do those things.
Yeah. One of the other things that was brought up in the research was this idea of shared knowledge of unique expertise. Can you explain what that's about and where that kind of weaves into all of this?
Certainly. I will describe it in my non-behavioral scientist terms and hope that Dr. Shore, if he's hearing this, sorry if I'm butchering this too badly, but shared knowledge of unique expertise is kind of what I alluded to a few moments ago. It's really just having an awareness of what the skill sets on the team are, what your strengths are, what your technical skill set looks like. You have the same awareness of what my strengths are, what my technical skills look like. And it's not just that general awareness that, oh, John's really good at malware analysis and reverse engineering. But on a more specific level, it's, here are the things that John has that the rest of the team don't have that we need to kind of address and sort of increase that collective, skill set, that transactive memory within the team, which is, next time a malware engineering or malware reverse engineering challenge comes up, it doesn't always have to be John that jumps in and takes care of that. We're kind of growing that skill set, and you're sharing those skills within the team. So we want to improve SKU, shared knowledge of unique expertise. That's kind of the goal there, is you want that to be, that transactive memory to be as robust as you can make it, so that we don't have these single points of failure throughout the team.
And I guess the key word there, the emphasized word, would be unique expertise, as in I know it and no one else knows it, right?
Yes.
That kind of stuff, because those are your potential weak points, right? And then
exactly
that's what makes your team fragile. So identifying the things that are potentially going to be a big problem if there's a small change in anything, really.
Right.
That's the kind of stuff to make sure you can be more resilient and kind of smooth that stuff out, right?
Yep, exactly.
One of the other things you had mentioned, kind of the opportunities for automation, right? We always think about technical automation and what we can do there. And that's obviously all great and wonderful, and we all love those sorts of things. But you said that there were maybe some missed opportunities relating to automation kind of in this discussion area as well. What were you referring to there?
Yeah, so I think a lot of these things that we're talking about, having been in this field for quite some time now, when we think about automation in security operations, our brains, I think, kind of automatically go to SOAR, right? Orchestration, automation, response, or custom scripts that help us do those traditional technical tasks faster and more effectively. And I think, of course, that's a great use case for automation. But I think a huge missed opportunity for automation is looking at this other problem set, which is, are you starting to exhibit some of these behaviors that may cause problems for your team if somebody becomes unavailable, or the situation changes, right? Are you building up that sort of false sense of confidence? And so, I think one of the things that we can use automation for is increasing this, your collaborative intelligence, right? I can go in. This is actually something that we're doing at Bionic is, we're going in and we're trying to help security teams, avoid some of these challenges and be more resilient and more effective. And a lot of times, again, the team can have all the best tools and they can have some really smart people, but they're still kind of having these challenges. They're still very reactive. If so-and-so isn't around today, the response looks really, really different than if, so-and-so, the rock star, is there to drive things and make some of those decisions. So I think one of the ways that we can use automation is kind of looking at your incident management capabilities, looking at your collaboration tools, mapping out kind of how the team is interacting with each other, how they're engaging other teams, who is doing the contributing, and identifying kind of areas of improvement there and sort of prompting the team, because in a crisis, especially as leads or as managers, we don't always stop in the middle of a crisis and step back while the building is burning down and say, you know what, I think this would be a good learning opportunity for, Sally to like jump in and take the lead on this, right? We're not always comfortable doing that. It's easy to say, but I think using automation to sort of prompt the team for those learning opportunities or identify kind of those trends, right? Hey, did you know that Mark has, user Mark accounts for 85% of your case updates, but you have a team of 15 people who all should be working cases and investigations, right? Again, kind of facilitating some of those metrics and data gathering, but also prompting the team to say, hey, this is a kind of threat that's in our threat model. We haven't really seen an incident for that particular threat lately. Why don't we schedule, a tabletop, or why don't we talk through kind of a scenario to help the team refresh their skill sets in these areas, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to leverage automation, where as people, we tend to get so focused on the crisis of the day or the week, it's sometimes difficult to step out of that or to identify some of these trends in collaboration or our multi-team interaction. But I think it's a great use case for automation. Definitely something that I'm working on right now.
Yeah, something like, I guess, maybe rephrasing that as using your automation tools to create metrics on stuff that might not be front of mind all the time, like in terms of work distribution. Like we all think of technical metrics all the time, but having, like a metric to point out like, hey, your distribution of who's doing what is changing and this and that kind of stuff. I think could be a really interesting way of going about it. One of the things I wanted to ask about the SKU, shared knowledge of unique expertise kind of thing. What tools, whether this is automation or not, right? It might be, it might not be. How would you go about as a manager or leader of a SOC identifying both the categories that might be those unique expertises? Like, is there a definitive list that you would use? And then how would you have your people kind of assess themselves against that, or you assess them? How do you take that and like get the state of the team?
Yeah, really great question. Because there are a lot of skills out there, right? So how do we sort of get to a more standard way of looking at that? One of the frameworks I found to be very useful in this area is the NICE framework, the NIST NICE framework, which is essentially it's a framework that helps organizations, originally designed for the U.S. government, but there's a lot of extensibility in the model to use it in a variety of different environments. But essentially, it's a way of standardizing skill statements, knowledge statements, ability statements. You have to know kind of these concepts. You have to be able to do these things. Those are the ability statements. And then from those statements, you build standard competencies. And each role within your team should have ideally one or more competencies. And so I think a lot of this goes all the way back to using some sort of standard framework, whether it's the NICE framework or something else, to have those standard role descriptions, be able to define those competencies and say, if you're a tier 1 security analyst, here are the things you have to know, here are the things you have to be able to do. And then that's what I'm going to assess you based on. And that's also kind of gets you to a standard list of things that you can say, this individual seems to have most or all of those things. This other individual is kind of lacking. Maybe they have the knowledge, maybe the ability, they're not able to bring these things to bear, or maybe vice versa. So you can start to pick out those things in a more standard way, as opposed to just saying, it just feels like this person seems to be less capable. I'm not really sure exactly how. So I think it all starts with standardizing those competencies that you need for those roles. And then that also has kind of the effect of making training discussions easier, making performance feedback a lot easier if you have those standard kind of role descriptions and competencies.
Hey, cybersecurity leaders and SOC managers. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you know about SANS Management 551, Building and Leading Security Operations Centers. It's a course made for anyone looking to build, improve, or be their most effective in leading a security operations team. But what I wanted to say was, since the release of Season 2 of Blueprint, we've had some exciting updates that I wanted to let you all know about. I'll start off by saying this. If there's one thing I've been surprised by this year, it's how quickly the new 5-day version of 551 has taken off with security ops team leaders around the world. We've seen continued rapid growth and interest in the course, no doubt given to probably the high rate of enormous damaging cyber attacks that have been happening over the last couple years. What you might not have heard is the good news that due to the popularity, GIAC immediately jumped on building a brand new security operations leadership certification to go with the course. So now, if you take Management 551, not only will you get 5 days of the standard SANS level of intense hands-on training with exercises, perhaps with Mark Orlando or myself as your instructor, but also a unique chance to be one of the first people in the whole world with the GIAC GSOM certification for security operations management. I'll tell you, this class is really, really fun. If you join us online or for one of our live classes, you're going to be taking the class with a peer group of security operations leaders from organizations all over the world and working with them on labs, facilitated discussions, and on our Cyber 42 exercise, which we run at the end of every day of the course. So this is a highly interactive and social course where you learn not just from the instructors, but also build your network of other security leaders who you can discuss your specific problems with and pick up best practices from as well. How cool is that? If you aren't sure if the course is for you, head on over to sans.org/MGT551, where you can check out the course syllabus and take a free demo section of the class. Thanks for checking it out and hope to see you online or at a conference in the near future. Now, back to Blueprint. So, when we hire people in a SOC, right? Like ideally they come with everything ready to go, all the competencies that would be needed. But of course, this is reality and humans don't all work like that. So, people will naturally have certain strengths and certain weaknesses. How do you as a manager kind of keep track of where people are falling behind? Is this a combination of them telling you and assessment? Well, maybe I'm kind of just jumping in with my own answer there, but
if only there was some kind of
how do you approach that problem?
You would give them supplemented by this other data. No, I think I think to your point about metrics, I think we've done kind of a mind meld there. I think part of it is collecting the right telemetry for you as a leader or a manager, so that you can identify when someone's falling down or lacking, and then sort of establishing that expectation that you're going to give them that constant constructive feedback. But I also think part of that assessment has to be a self-assessment to say, here's what I've seen, but what do you think? Where do you think you're kind of weak? What are those situations where you find yourself uncomfortable, or not able to, make the decisions you have to make? So I think that's part of it too. But I think from a management perspective, it's all about getting all of those inputs. And, of course, that's a variety of different things. Doing regular quality review of those investigations, those incidents, looking at how people are utilizing the tools, looking at your detections. You have to have visibility in order to identify those issues and take action. But yeah, certainly self-assessment is a big part of that as well.
Yeah, so that was kind of my approach, and kind of some of the stuff we talk about in class, obviously. Have people tell you what they feel, what they're strong at and what they're not strong at, as well as kind of have that outside assessment, whether it's metrics from your tools or cyber talent, assessments of, whatever it is. You kind of want to know what people think they're good at, and then what kind of other data seems to show, and try to line those two things up and make sure you can stay on top of those differences. Right. In terms of all of that was kind of inside the SOC and maybe all within, SOC analysts and the talent pool there. But back to multi-team systems, what should we be looking at to assess whether our team is working well with other teams?
That's good. So, I think that there are some lead indicators here and some lagging indicators to use some of our Management 551 focus areas. And I think some leading indicators would be kind of going back to the BlackHat presentation. We talked about kind of mapping out those interactions. And one of the things that Dr. Shore and I touched on that Dr. Shore came up with was, hey, you can actually proactively go out and you can list out all the teams and the people that participate in incident response. And then you can map out how intense or how active those interactions are in a crisis scenario, so that you can see visually, I know that my threat hunting group and my incident responders, they're the most active and they're working together the closest in an incident, or my incident responders and network engineering, they're working together. It's ongoing, real time, a lot of talking and interaction. So if you can map out sort of those interactions, then you can kind of be a little bit more deliberate and intentional in bringing those teams together in your tabletop exercises, trying to gather metrics for, are those handoffs happening fast enough? Is that network team or the service desk, are they getting the details that they need, right? Sort of including that in your metrics to make sure that aligns to what you perceive the interaction looks like. I also think we always talk about after action and lessons learned following an incident. And all too often, those efforts are focused just on how my team did, right? How well did we do our analysis and response? But I think that's another sort of argument for bringing those other teams into the conversation, because you may feel your team is doing great and is very consistent and doing all the right things. But I think getting those inputs from the other teams, understanding if those handoffs and that collaboration is working the way that it should, that's also a critical part of that after action kind of review. I would argue maybe even a more important part, because you can do all the quality analysis and investigation in the world, but it's easy to miss the forest for the trees and forget that the goal there is for the organization to recover from an incident, not for your analysis to be super detailed, high quality. You've got all the attribution and everything in there. Like, that's great, but we got to make sure that everybody's working together effectively to remediate that incident. So I think part of it is making sure to collect those lead indicators and looking at that interaction, but also doing that broader after action review. It's a big part of it as well.
So on a team that was working on, let's say, an organization that's working kind of in an ideal state, right? They've practiced this, they've done what they should do. Maybe this is too big of a question to easily describe on a podcast. Maybe it's not. But could you walk through what it would look like if everything was working perfectly? Like when the breach is discovered, like who knows what, and how do those things kind of go smoothly? Like, paint the ideal picture for us if you can.
Wow. So the ideal picture is, I would say the ideal picture is if I could go back and look at all of the incidents that happened in let's say a 3-month period. And especially if I have a team in place, right? The ideal picture would be my incident response looks exactly the same. My metrics were consistent, performance was consistent. There were no, if we could kind of talk Six Sigma for a minute, there were no defects, there were no deviations, there was no variance in how we conducted those investigations and how we responded. And looking at the people who worked that incident, it was different every single time. Like, that's what I would ideally like to see. Doesn't matter who is doing the analysis, and it doesn't matter who's leading the investigation and the response. It's consistent every time. I think, that would sort of get to the heart of many of the things that we're talking about today. I also think that, when it comes to building up that transactive memory, ideally, in the course of those 3 months, the organization is getting more resilient. We're getting more defensible. So if I take a sampling of those incidents from the last 3 months, they shouldn't be the same incidents that are happening over and over again. We have an incident that deals with some sort of email-based threat, and then immediately following that incident, we're able to pivot, make some additional investments, maybe deploy some more effective controls, right? And we're starting to address those problems. Not to say that cybersecurity is something we're going to solve, certainly not in the span of 3 months, but I think those are the kind of two of the trends that I would look for is, consistency, regardless of the individual team members, and also, forward progress, which is we have an issue, we're addressing, responding to the crisis, and then trying to solve the underlying issues, as opposed to, we have this team and we just have to keep investing in them constantly forever so that they can keep responding to the same issues over and over again. That's always, not to kind of talk out of both sides of my mouth here, where Of course, I'm heavily invested in having ongoing security operations and making investments there, but that's something that's always sort of not really sat well with me, which is, you just have to invest in this capability in perpetuity forever because you're always just going to have to do this activity. And I think that's fine, but those activities should change over time. You shouldn't be having, to respond to the same things over and over again.
Yeah, I love that answer. That's a great way of putting it. Consistency in performance, regardless of who's doing it, and then not seeing the same thing over and over. And when I hear, as you say that, I'm thinking already in my mind, like, all right, well, what does a team that's doing that look like, right? What are the metrics we could look at there? And that may be timing of, when this person does X versus when the other person does X, it's roughly the same process. We have some kind of way of saying, when this situation arises, this is how we're going to handle it. So it's, we have playbooks, maybe premeditated for this kind of stuff. Did we use them? Did they work? Did things flow as we expected? And then looking at maybe metrics for not seeing the same thing twice, right? So maybe a category of incident, and then, maybe you're graphing that in ways that say like, oh, it happened a bunch, and then we see it kind of disappear as a problem, or ideally only happen once and then never show up again. The kind of the nature of those things. Anything else there you can think of that would be a good thing to watch for, to kind of check for those things?
I think on a more qualitative front, to kind of be more sort of current events with this. I'm sure you're aware, we had kind of some news drop over the weekend, over this Memorial Day weekend, right? That we're just coming out of as we're taping this, is a flaw in Microsoft Office, right? And a fairly bad one. And just kind of like watching this play out like in social media and in some of the channels that I'm a member of, as I'm sure you are, it was really interesting to see, like almost in real time, there was a camp that was like, there goes our Memorial Day weekend. Guess we're, jumping into this fight. Like, let's go, right? We have a lot of work to do, right? And then there was another camp that was like, all right, everybody, obviously this is bad. We have to address it. But, if you're doing the right things, if you, have your detections in place, even if someone exploits this kind of flaw, hopefully you should still be able to catch it. You should be okay. So let's not like kill everyone's vacation, stay calm, right? Carry on. So to me, it's always interesting to see that sort of dichotomy there. And I think from a qualitative perspective, we should try to be in that, keep calm, sort of carry on camp, knowing that there may be some instances where we're caught off guard and we have to go do a bunch of work to respond to these kinds of things. Ideally, we should try to get to that point where we know these things are going to come up. We know we might not always have the logs, the visibility, the mitigations for them, but we still have some confidence to say, but we've got, that defense in depth. We've got really solid like detections for kind of post-exploit activity, like those kinds of things. Or, I know my team is such that even if someone exploits this, like we're going to be able to respond very effectively, and I don't have to jump in and do a whole bunch of work right now today. I think that's where we should be trying to like push our teams. And I thought that was a really kind of interesting case study we had some people that were like, no, cancel Memorial Day, like cancel that barbecue. Guess what we're doing? And then other people saying, yeah, this is bad, but I know I'm still going to be able to respond reliably and identify this, even if I didn't account for this flaw. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it was just something that I thought was
totally
interesting, and where we should try to get to is that other kind of like, yeah, this is bad, but we're not, coming in from the barbecue to deal with it just yet, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's kind of, I think that what you described is the difference between a resilient team and one that isn't, right? It's like there's a disturbance in whatever, and you just kind of move around it, you compensate for it, and you continue on without too much of a disturbance, as opposed to one that is just like, anything sends you off a cliff, right?
Exactly.
Yep. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that seems like a great place to end this conversation. For the listeners, if they want to find this actual research, what can they Google? How do they locate this?
So I can give you a link. So the research team, Dr. Shore and his team, they published like a free online book, and I'll give you the link for the show notes. Right,
Awesome.
You post show notes.
Yep, absolutely.
So I'll give you the link for that, and I'll also include the link to our BlackHat presentation, which summarizes a lot of their findings, and also kind of pairs it with my, perhaps less scientific viewpoint, coming from many, many years in security operations. So it's kind of both sides of that, but I'll make sure I give you the links for that so we can include them in the show notes.
Perfect. All right. Well, with that, I think we've got it wrapped up here. Thank you, Mark Orlando, for the second appearance on Blueprint. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, John.
All right. Talk to you later.